Exodus chapter 1 is where we're picking up. And I guess we'll just start reading at the top of page 40 in your workbook. That gives you a little bit of the background. Nearly 400 years have passed since God used Joseph not only to provide for the physical needs of the people in Egypt and the surrounding regions, but also to provide the rest of Joseph's family a safe place to live. The family line of the Savior, promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and confirmed to go through Jacob's son Judah, is safe. The promise of a global Savior is safe. Exodus is the beginning of the story of God keeping his other promises to Abraham's children, to lead them back to the land that he had promised. And so what you'll notice, at the left end of the timeline, around 1900, is when Joseph was ruler of Egypt, and this is Moses is born toward the end of the 1600s, shortly before 1500. So with that, Exodus chapter 1, if you want to follow along, I'll read. I guess we'll start in verse 5. So Exodus, second book of the Bible. Yeah, we're all there. The total number of Jacob's descendants was 70 people. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, as did all his brothers and that entire generation. However, the Israelites were fruitful, multiplied quickly, increased in number, and became very numerous. So the land was filled with them. Then a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelites are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Let's come up with a wise plan to prevent them from increasing in number. Otherwise, if war breaks out, they would join with our enemies and fight against us. Then they would leave the land." So the Egyptians placed taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. The Israelites built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, the more they increased in number, and the more they spread out. The Egyptians were filled with dread because of them. So the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites by forcing them to work very hard. The Egyptians made the Israelites' lives bitter with hard work, with brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. The Egyptians were merciless in the way they imposed work on the Israelites. The king of Egypt also spoke to the Hebrew midwives. One of them was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah. He said, "When you help the Hebrew women give birth while they are still on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a son, you are to kill him. But if you see that it is a daughter, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God, so they did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do, but they let the boys live. The king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why did you do this and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous, so they give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God treated the midwives well. The people also increased in number and became very numerous. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Pharaoh, however, commanded all his people, "Every son who is born you shall throw into the Nile, but every daughter you shall let live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and took a Levite woman as a wife. The woman became pregnant and bore a son. When she saw that he was a special child, she hid him for 3 months. When she was no longer able to hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it in the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile, and her attendants were walking along the bank of the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant girl to get it. She opened it and saw the child. It was a boy, and he was crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a wet nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes, go." So the young woman went and called the child's mother to come. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you for doing it." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, with the explanation, "Because I drew him up out of the water." All right, any questions on that? Pretty straightforward, I guess. Looking at chapter 1, especially verses 15 through 22. Give you a couple minutes with those seated nearby. What would be some of the concerns on these midwives' minds when they hear what Pharaoh said to them, and then what they're supposed to do? So, what are some of the concerns or the worries that would be on their minds in verses 15 through 22?
What else besides that? Well, they didn't do it.
All right. So, what are some of the concerns that these midwives would have to consider? Yeah.
They probably wouldn't want to like kill someone else's kid.
Yeah. And so I guess a little bit of explanation, like a midwife is somebody who helps a woman when she's giving birth, helps, tell her what to do. And, I guess that's the shortest way of putting it, helps a woman when she's giving birth, but the woman is doing all the work. That's why we call it labor. All right. So yeah, she would have to, under order of the Pharaoh, she would have to kill this child if it was a boy. Right. What else?
She would have to chuck the child into the Nile River.
Yeah. And and that was Pharaoh's order that we hear at the end of the chapter, that even that the Pharaoh had given a very specific command for these midwives. And then he gave a general command for all the Israelite people. And so these midwives were supposed to be like doubly accountable. All right. What are some other concerns that they would have to think about?
Well,
Yeah, Jim.
thing that she said, the first thing, what about, what's the midwife going to do when the mother doesn't want to give the baby to her?
Yeah, there's the fact that this woman has carried a child for most of a year, and now she's just given birth, and then a midwife is supposed to help have a safe delivery. AJ.
I was gonna say that they are also kind of conservative, like what God would think about it.
Definitely.
Said that they're very God-fearing.
All right, Shifra and Pua are described as very God-fearing, and so they recognize time out, Pharaoh. It's not right to kill somebody, even if that is this tiny little infant who was just born. That's still a person, and that would still be murder. And so they're kind of like, okay, I either do what God says and preserve this life, not kill this child, but I risk being in trouble with the government or being thrown in prison, like Joseph was, or maybe myself being thrown to the crocodiles. Who knows? There may be some other things there where maybe they would lose their job. And how do you provide for your family if your job's been taken away? So there'd be a number of concerns there. How did it work out for them toward the end of verses 20, 21, 22? Yeah.
It ended up going good because they had faith.
Yeah. They how about that? They lied to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's like, time out. How is it that all these women are still giving birth to babies, to baby boys? They're like, instead of just saying we are purposely disobeying you, they said, they just give birth so quickly we don't get there in time. So they lied to Pharaoh. They didn't get caught, and God showed that he agreed with their course of action by providing for them, blessing them, and giving them families. So what does God think of their lie? Is it right to lie? Yeah.
Well, they were obeying God. You're supposed to obey God before man, and they were obeying God. So therefore,
The ends justifies the means. As long as you obey God on the big one, then do whatever it takes in between.
oh no, no.
That was an overstatement, but yeah. Any other thoughts? Was it okay for them to lie? Or should they have told the truth and said, Pharaoh, I am not killing that baby, and you can throw me in prison, or you can kill me before I would do that. Yeah.
I think it's kind of like the use of kids kind of justified.
Mhm.
But it's probably more important to fear God than it is to fear.
Definitely.
I guess it's mostly just like this circumstance.
Yeah. And whenever you talk about what do you do in this particular or that situation, it's always in the details, and the details matter a lot because they might change one detail, and then how you get to that decision at the end might be a little bit different. And so I think with them, I could see it as one plausible circumstance that either they lie to Pharaoh, they keep their job, and they continue delivering healthy Hebrew baby boys who don't get killed, or they tell the truth to Pharaoh, they lose their job or get put in prison or get executed, and then Pharaoh gives them a new midwife who will do exactly as he orders. I think that's definitely a consideration. And so the question, is it wrong to lie to Pharaoh? Well, yeah. Is it wrong to kill a baby? Definitely. Usually we think of that as, with these two decisions, which one is the lesser of the two evils? Telling a lie versus killing somebody. I would tell a lie. But to flip it around and think of it as which one is the greater of two goods, where it's a good thing to preserve a life and it's a good thing to tell the truth. But to preserve a life is an even greater thing. And so I think that would be a reasonable explanation for what happened and how God had chosen to bless them in line with that course of action. Perhaps another one might be a more modern example is if somebody, knocked on your door in the middle of the night and said, I'm an escaped slave in the 19th century, heading north to Canada on the Underground Railroad. Or your neighbor knocked on the door and said, my whole family is Jewish and everybody just found out. And now they're coming to take me to a concentration camp. Will you hide me? And then do you lie to protect this person? Well, yeah, and I think in a lot of cases you could do that with a completely clean conscience. Even though, in most circumstances, lying, it's better to tell the truth. At the same time, recognizing that given the option of doing a good thing by telling the truth and doing something that's even better by protecting somebody's life, even at the risk of my own life, might be a better course of action. But that's one of those things to kind of, think through ahead of time, whether it's the Hebrew midwives or slavery in the 19th century or Germany in the 20th century, or fill in the blank. Any other questions about Shifra and Pua? I think this event helps us to narrow down when the Exodus actually happened, because if Pharaoh was concerned about was just concerned about the size of the nation, then he would have said to kill the baby girls, because you need the baby girls in order to grow a larger nation. But if he was concerned about being attacked sometime in the next 20 to 40 years, that's where he says that if somebody else attacks us, then the Hebrew people will have a massive army. And so the boys would have been able to serve in that army, 20 years down the line. And Pharaoh was basically thinking, as long as I, make sure that they don't have a Hebrew army here for the next 20 or 30 years, then he could maybe finish out his reign and not have any problems to deal with. All right, Exodus chapter 1 and 2, Moses' birth and rescue. Number 1, what does chapter 1, verse 8 tell us about how things have changed during the 400 years since Joseph lived? Yeah.
There's a new Pharaoh, and the Hebrews are.
All right, excellent. Yeah, there's a new Pharaoh, and in the note that he knew nothing about Joseph, and so he also enslaved the Israelites. And by this time, the Israelites have grown to a fairly massive nation, probably over 1 million people. And it's because it's been 400 years, and they had come down to there with 70 people in that entourage, in addition to the 4 people from Joseph's family. And so they aren't just living there on their own, they are being put to hard labor. All the jobs that the Egyptians don't want to do. All right, how about number 2? What was the king's reason for enslaving the Israelites? Looking especially at verses 9 and 10. Jamie.
There's more of them and they're more powerful.
All right, yeah. He's looking around and he's like, wait, time out. There are a lot of them in comparison to us. However you want to summarize that. Pharaoh says, there's just a lot. And one of the reasons that he's concerned is that even though he doesn't know about Joseph, or doesn't care about Joseph if he does know, is that in that intervening time, the Egyptian nation had been attacked by some people that were called the Hyksos. And so the Hyksos were kind of from the same area that the Israelites were from. And so now he's thinking, oh boy, we're going to have this all over again, where they're going to have another nation assist them. Number 3, we touched on this one already. What horrific command did Pharaoh give to the Israelite midwives? Yeah.
He said to throw the baby boys in the Nile River.
All right, throw the boys in the Nile River. Kill the baby boys. And I think the way that he put it, I mean, just looking at chapter 1, it seems like he had something specifically to these women. Like call in these Hebrew midwives, and he told them, you need to kill that boy if you see it. And then that command about the Nile River is just in general for the rest of the nation, in the hopes that the Israelite people would, would keep an eye on their neighbor and maybe even, hurt their neighbor's baby in order to be a faithful Egyptian. It's a little strange. Number 4, what did the midwives do instead? Yeah.
They didn't kill the babies.
They didn't. They ignored it completely. And then when Pharaoh calls them in, then they lie about it, which meant, I guess, that they didn't lose their job. All right, number 5 says the top of page 41. Read the 4th and 5th commandments, and as well as Peter's words to those who much later who would command him and the other apostles to stop telling people about Jesus. How do we balance obeying the government and obeying God? The 4th commandment in the blue box there: honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not dishonor or anger our parents and others in authority, but honor, serve, and obey them and give them love and respect. And the 5th commandment: you shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and befriend him in every bodily need. And the Acts 5 verse 29 was what Jim had alluded to previously, when Peter and the apostles say we must obey God rather than men. And if you read the next verse, then they were whipped and then they were released. So even though they chose to disobey, they still received some form of punishment. So looking at the 4th commandment, which is commanding obedience to those in authority, and the 5th commandment, which is commanding us to preserve life, how do we balance obeying the government and obeying God? Yeah.
Well, I guess you obey God over the government, but at the same time, you don't want to like break the rules of the government. And then obviously in this case, like lives, we want to do what's like morally that killing somebody is a lot worse.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's very comprehensive. Anything else that we would like to add to that? And generally speaking, I mean, the way it's phrased here on the screen, we must always obey the government unless it tells us to sin. That's our starting point. And also at the same time, like we had a discussion about this in our Sunday morning Bible class, and it was probably 4 Sundays in a row, where we talked about some of the details of that we live in a country where the citizens are expected to participate in the government in some form, and that we have a specific right of speech that is protected for the individual citizen. And so there are some forms of protest. You know, if a government makes an unjust law or an immoral law, or even a law that starts to infringe on responsibilities that don't belong to that government, then it is permissible for a Christian to say, I want to speak up, whether that's writing a letter to the editor or joining in like a march, like a protest of some sort, as long as it's peaceful. We generally, you know, where we start isn't just we obey the government in everything unless they are commanding us to sin. Even before that, we start with, we need to respect the authorities that God has placed over us. And I think AJ's comment about the morality of something is definitely something to keep in mind. You know, for example, this was back in Ottawa about 15 years ago already. There was, you know, the way that marriage works is that Pastor Hagen can marry 2 people who come to me. That the state, and in the eyes of the state of Ohio, if 2 people come to me and say we want to get married, then I marry them and then they're legally married. You could also go to a judge and get married or something like that. And back in Canada, the government wanted to make a law that, since they had passed marriage as being 2 men or 2 women, they wanted to make a law that said, if you marry people, then you have to marry anybody who comes to you. And so our churches there in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, our churches said, okay, time out. if this law passes, then we have to marry whoever comes to us, no matter if they are our members or not, or no matter if it's 2 men, 2 women, or a man and a woman. And so it was kind of the same question of the government isn't commanding us to sin. They aren't, but then if that law passed, they would. And so I think what our pastors had decided that if that law passed, then they would say, okay, just we're gonna give up our authority to marry people, and you can go get married at the courthouse and then come here and we'll have a church wedding celebration. And I think that was a reasonable answer. But I think because it number one demonstrates a respect for the government and the governing authorities, as well as has a clear understanding of what the Bible has to say about morality. Whether it's immoral to, in this case from Exodus, immoral to kill a baby. Yes, most definitely. And to have a proper understanding of that is something that we need to always have in mind and to continue to grow in. We'll talk about that all day. Any other questions about the 4th and 5th commandments? So that's at least an introduction on the topic. How about this? A little bit more direct. Number 6, was it okay for the midwives to directly disobey a command given by their governmental leader? Yeah.
I think it is because I went with like God's word instead of going with the government's word.
Excellent. And together with that even though they're doing the biblically, morally correct thing, they still might get in trouble in this world. They still might be imprisoned or worse. I think I'll add that. And in this case, he was telling them directly that they needed to commit murder. Because when there's a conflict between our faith and what the government commands us to do, like in this case, we don't have the right to force the government to follow our religion. Although we could make a moral argument, if AJ was the doctor who said, no, I'm not going to be killing babies when I'm delivering babies. AJ could make a perfectly rational and reasonable appeal and say, well, it's a good thing to be raising all these boys because it makes for a healthy community who can do a lot of hard work, or you'll have an army and if you or whatever the case may be. I think that's at least helpful. How about number 7? After Moses was born, his mother hid him. What did she do when she couldn't hide him anymore? Especially looking at verse 3 of chapter 2.
Put it in a basket that was covered with
Like pitch? Mm-hmm. All right, so she put him in a waterproof basket, a basket woven of papyrus reeds, and then coated it with pitch, and then put him in the reeds of the Nile River, so that he wasn't just like floating down the river, but he was kind of stuck in the reeds there. And then when somebody was walking by, they're like, oh, that's a little strange. It's like a basket or something. I should go see what that is. Yeah. All right. All right, so number 8. How did God end up working a near tragedy into something good? If you especially compare verse 3 with verse 10. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here with Miriam and her request. So how did it end up in verse 10? Let's start there, and then we'll work our way backward from there.
King Pharaoh's daughter's son.
All right. This baby who was supposed to have been killed when he was born is now regarded as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then I guess working backward from even before he moves out and moves up to the palace, in verses 8 and 9, when Miriam is hiding in the reeds and then she comes out. What's the arrangement for taking care of the baby?
It was the baby's mother, right?
Yeah. And so Miriam is like,
To take care of her own son.
yeah, that's pretty awesome. Miriam is about 12 years older than Moses. And so this Moses, number one, God kept him alive and he was not killed as a baby. And then number two, when his mother can't hide him anymore, 3 months old and can't, they're very active. Then Miriam brings the child back to his mother, and mom gets paid to raise her own child, which is pretty cool. And the reason, that Miriam said, well, I can go find somebody to nurse the baby for you. They couldn't just go down to the local, Walgreens and get some baby formula off the shelves. I'm sure they had some sort of substitute that they often use, but by and large, these babies relied on a mom to provide the milk that they needed until they were able to, chew and swallow and eat their own food. So God preserved him. God kept the family together especially during Moses's youth. And then when he's, maybe, I don't know, around 12 years old, I forget if they said exactly how old he was. He would grow up in Pharaoh's house and be regarded as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And it seems like he received a good education there, which comes in handy later in life. Next one, Exodus chapter 3. Can I go put you in the Maumee River? All right. Yeah, I skipped over Exodus 2. So the note there on page 41, the two summary points. About the time Moses was 40 years old, he fled Midian after impulsively killing an Egyptian. Then after 40 years in the land of Midian, where he got married and had children, one day Moses saw a very odd thing while tending sheep, a bush on fire that didn't burn up. And so Moses's life divides up fairly nicely into 3 different sections. He lived to 120 or just over 120. So the first 40 years he lived in Egypt. And so that includes at least 30 years of being regarded and educated as Pharaoh's, son and grandson. The next 40 years he's living in Midian as a shepherd. And he gets married and has a family there in Midian. And then the last 40 years and a little bit is the time of the Exodus and the wandering in the desert. And then when he's 120 years old, then he dies on Mount Nebo, and then God buried him there. So Exodus 3 reads like this. Now Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, a priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in blazing fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but the bush was not burning up. So he said, I will go over and look at this amazing sight to find out why the bush is not burning up. When the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to take a look, God called to him from the middle of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Moses said, I am here. The Lord said, do not come any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. He then said, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have certainly seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their cry for help because of their slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. This is a fun one. We got a bunch of names here. To the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now indeed, the Israelites' cry for help has come to me. Yes, I have seen how the Egyptians are oppressing them. Come now, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you. This will be the sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I say to them? So God replied to Moses, I am who I am. He also said, you will say this to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also told Moses, say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is how I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have certainly been paying attention to you and to what they have done to you in Egypt. So I have said that I will bring you up from the misery in Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice. Then you and the elders of Israel will go to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now let us go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go unless he is forced to do so by a powerful hand. So I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in their midst. Afterward, he will let you go. I will give this people favor with the Egyptians, so that when you go, you will not go out empty-handed. Each woman is to ask her neighbor, as well as any woman staying in her house, for articles of silver, articles of gold, and articles of clothing. You are to put them on your sons and daughters. In this way you will plunder the Egyptians. But Moses responded, what if they do not believe me and do not listen to my voice, but instead they say, the Lord has not appeared to you? So the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. He said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, so he ran away from it. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and take it by the tail. He stretched out his hand and took hold of it, and it became a staff in his hand. The Lord said, this sign is being given to you, so that the Israelites will believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. The Lord also said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. So he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, his hand was leprous, as white as snow. Then the Lord said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand inside his cloak again, and when he took it out of his cloak, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. The Lord said, if they do not believe you or do not respond to the first sign, they might believe because of the second sign. If they do not believe even these 2 signs or listen to your voice, you are to take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry land. The water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. But Moses said to the Lord, excuse me, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or more recently, or even since you started speaking to your servant, for my mouth and tongue are slow and clumsy. So the Lord said to him, who made a mouth for people, or who makes someone mute or deaf, able to see, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be your mouth, and I will teach you what you will speak. But he said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and the Lord said, "What about Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Look, he's already coming out to meet you. He'll be very glad to see you. You will speak to him and put the words into his mouth. I will be with your mouth and with his, and I will teach you what you are to do. He will speak to the people for you, so that it will be as if he were your mouth and you were God to him. You will also take this staff in your hand, the one with which you will perform the signs." All right. Some days are kind of like that, where you're like, my talking is slow and clumsy. Everybody. All right. I'll give you a minute or two to review the part that we just read and tell what you think about all of Moses's excuses, as well as should Moses be making excuses to God. I'll give you a minute or two.
Why was he making excuses? Which,
All right. What do you think about Moses's excuses? Moses is one of those people where you don't put an apostrophe S because everybody knows who he is, like Moses and Jesus, apparently. Are they good excuses? We'll start with that. Yeah. Moses, you're not even trying. And at this time, Moses is like 80 years old. We hear that he didn't like lose his eyesight or need glasses or weaken with age a whole lot. So God had preserved him to some extent. But if you know one of our members, Bob, I think he's just turned 86 or 87. He used to be like 80 years old. All right. So what else about Moses's excuses? Of course, he used to be 80 years old. They're not good excuses. Should he be making these excuses? Why not?
Because you're making excuses to God.
Yeah. Because what else is that excuse saying when God's like, Moses, I want you to go to the Israelites. And Moses is like, blah, 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 I can't. You should pick somebody else. I'm bad at this.
He's like doubting himself.
What's that?
He's like doubting himself.
All right.
He's like this lazy person that wants to sit on the couch
Yeah.
all day.
Yeah, I don't want to go back there. I just want to, hang out and watch sheep for the rest of my life instead of dealing with the Egyptians. So it's doubting himself. It's doubting the abilities that God has given to him. And it's also ends up being this kind of subtle accusation. God, you shouldn't pick me. Pick somebody else because you're making a mistake by picking me. Then there's also that the Israelites, he's wondering if the Israelites will believe him, that God has spoken to him. And how does God answer that? It seems like God is very patient with him through all of chapter 3. And then, yeah, so he gives him some miracles. First is this snake, just threw his staff on the ground. And then the leprosy hand. And then that kind of cool one with dumping out the blood or the water from the Nile and it turned to blood. He doesn't actually have to do that until the first of the 10 plagues. And he does that before Pharaoh. Anything else? Do you think people make excuses to God today? I mean, he hasn't appeared to you in a burning bush, as far as I know. I mean, if you think he has, we should talk. But do you think people make excuses to God today? And so it's almost like you can just replay everything that we heard, talked about with Moses. That's a dumb excuse, and you should grow up and not make an excuse to God because he's God and you're not. That sometimes, and there are gentler ways of saying that. But sometimes we need a little bit of an illustration to see, oh, well, Moses is being very, very petty and childish here, but I can be petty and childish, and I don't need a burning bush to tell me that. Okay. Number 9. I don't know about you, but that picture on page 41, I am sorely disappointed at the size of that burning bush. And like most of the images thus far have been decent. Not the best, not the worst, but decent. Did you grow up with those with the blue and the red and the green like hardcover books for Bible history? Yeah. I don't know, every now and then we find one somewhere, and that was like two-tone. It was like black and white, and then they had orange as like this 3-color picture. Maybe I'll bring one if I remember it next week. Yeah, we have a few sitting around the house, and if we see any, we just pick it up because there's always somebody to share it with. Yeah.
If someone came in there and saw him just talking to a bush, they would be so weirded out. Why are you talking to a bush?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and it caught Moses's attention because it was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. Like you wait long enough, maybe there was a lightning strike, then the fire will burn out. But that bush just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going.
So you think he's probably been watching it for quite a while? I mean, he was tending to flock and just noticed it.
What else is there to do?
Right, it hadn't been burning up. So, but I'm saying it's not something he just noticed and walked away from it. It probably took him a while to realize, wait, it's not burning.
Yeah. Imagine like you lead the sheep out that morning, or the sheep are waking up and you're sleeping out by the flock. And I imagine he has a couple dogs because I like dogs. And he sees it off in the distance, and then he, digs a little trench so the sheep can drink from some still and quiet water instead of the rushing little river that's right there. And then he looks again, oh, it's still burning. And then he has his lunch, and then he's like, that thing is still burning. I should go see this. Number 10. Because on Fridays, we have a Bible class with usually with older, like retired people, and they like having coffee and or donuts or cake or whatever else.
Old people like
Coffee cake. You have coffee, and then you have like this stale cake that tastes terrible unless you dunk it in your coffee.
I love coffee.
what?
Full of cinnamon. Yeah.
What does coffee cake even taste like?
Oh, it's good.
Like cinnamon, sugar,
Coffee.
Yeah.
butter.
Coffee cake.
Love
And I mean, I should nuance that a little bit. It's not always old and stale. Usually Bob brings
Putting
one
hot
like,
coffee in it?
If it's
No.
fresh, good coffee.
No, I think
Yeah.
hot coffee cake.
but there have been a time or two where it's sat in the fridge for like 3 weeks and then Bob still brings it out. So I was like, okay. If you like
Usually
coffee.
during the morning with coffee. It's more like a
Oh.
donut than a cake.
Yeah. How about number 10? According to chapter 3, verse 2, what's going on with this burning bush that is not burning up?
It's one of the angels of the Lord. It's like supposed to talk to Moses.
All right. So the angel of the Lord was appearing to Moses. And if you have, take a minute and try to think of when else we've had this so-called angel of the Lord talk to one of the believers. That was back in the book of Genesis, because we're only in, our first lesson of Exodus. Any other times? Yeah.
Is that when Abraham tried to like, sacrifice his son?
Yeah, exactly. And so back in, Genesis, I don't know, what would that be, like 20 or something, 22? God had told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham is all set, and he's just about to kill his son and burn his son up as a whole burnt offering. And the angel of the Lord says, no, don't do it, Abraham, because I've seen that you are willing to sacrifice your son, your only son. Yeah.
Didn't he speak to Noah too? To tell
I don't think so. I have to go back and look, because the curious thing about this angel of the Lord is, and we'll have it at least one more time with Gideon's parents, is that this angel of the Lord is talked about as being distinct from God, but then when the angel of the Lord speaks, he speaks as God, which we had with Abraham sacrificing Isaac. It's the angel of the Lord speaking, and then all the things he says, that I have seen your faith, Abraham, and I am telling you that I will make you into a great nation. And the same thing here. The angel of the Lord spoke from the bush and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, what we understand from that, just kind of putting it together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. Do you guys still do that? I don't know. I made puzzles as a kid, but
That's what we did all winter.
hey, there you go. Yeah, wintertime in Ohio, when the skies are only gray, but there's no snow. That you kind of put the details together like a jigsaw puzzle, and the best answer that we have is that this angel of the Lord is a term for the Son of God in the Old Testament. Like the angel of the Lord who looks like a son of man, walking in the fiery furnace with the 3 men in the fiery furnace. We'll come around to that again. Number 11, how does God identify himself? Looking especially at verse 6. Yeah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is going to be a big deal when we get to the New Testament, because God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Abraham has been, buried for over 400 years, closer to 500 years by this point. And so when God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jesus points to this verse and says that is proof that when believers pass away, that their soul goes to be with God in heaven, and that they continue to live with God there in heaven. All right. Number 12, what instructions did God give to Moses? See especially verses 7, 8, 9, and 10. There are multiple. Yeah.
Well, he tells them to go back to Egypt and tell the Pharaoh that they have to leave within 3 days.
All right.
Take a 3 day trip. But then they just don't come back.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think of that? Where God sends Moses down, and look it up on YouTube, that fantastic old song, Go Down Moses, all the way down to Egypt town. It's fantastic. Maybe we'll play it if we have a little bit of time at the end. God says, go down to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let us go on a 3-day trip to go offer some sacrifices. When God has also said that he's heard the cry and their misery about their slavery, and God is going to bring them into a promised land. So why does God have Moses say it's just going to be for 3 days and just for a sacrifice, and then we'll be back? Because the sacrifices, it involves a lot of blood, and you Egyptians don't like that. Yeah.
Just so like he has just let them go and not say that they would be
All right. Yeah, that's a good start. Might have-
Time to get a certain distance away, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's on the one hand, are they just going to, pack up and then go 3 days out into the desert and then they have a 3-day head start? There's definitely that. And I think the other part of it is that God is showing that Pharaoh doesn't want to accommodate any reasonable request. Even if they do go out to make some sacrifices for a while, Pharaoh doesn't even want that to happen. And he's got horses and chariots and armies where he could chase down 1 million people, fairly easily, which he does. I guess we'll put this up here. And so I think that part about God saying, well, take a 3-day trip out into the wilderness, and Pharaoh still won't let you go, where he starts with this very simple request. And Pharaoh is going to be the one who persistently says, no, I'm not going to do anything that you want to do. And Pharaoh's heart is going to be even more hardened in rejecting what God has said, with the result of all the plagues and all the destruction that's going to fall on Egypt can squarely be placed on Pharaoh's back. That Pharaoh was the one who led his people down that path. It's kind of cool when we get to the next lesson talking about the 10 plagues, is that in order, God dismantles the 10 major gods of the Egyptians, starting with the Nile River. Number 13, why was Moses' early life good preparation for this work? Not talking about like the first, month, couple days in the reeds. Yeah.
just because like he is the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, that they might.
All right. So they might believe him a little bit more. He definitely got the royal treatment in that, he had a lot more exposure to the government and those kind of details. And he knew he would understand what God was saying when he said, well, we're going to start with the Nile River and all the other plagues that kind of go from there. It's quite possible, I would say probable, that he was well educated in how to write. And even the oldest Hebrew writing that we have looks fairly similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs. There's obviously some change because hieroglyphs are like pictures, and then writing like we have it, or Hebrew writing, uses letters that you assemble into words. So I mean, that was a big change. But Moses was the one who was instructed in how to write, and he was the one who ends up writing the first 5 books of the Bible. If you ever watched the 10 Commandments, the old movie with Charlton Heston, when Moses goes back to Egypt, he's kind of pictured as, running into this woman who had been his mom, and then running, and then the Pharaoh at the time is this guy who would have been considered his brother. I mean, that's possible. It's not necessarily, but it's definitely possible. Okay. Number 14, why might it have been terrifying for Moses to do this work? Just this guy wandering from Midian and say, all right, Pharaoh, let my people go. Maybe it's not scary at all. Yeah.
I guess he hasn't been there for 40 years, and the last time he was there, somebody.
Yeah. This is kind of a big deal. Like Moses ran out of the country because he killed an Egyptian. He killed somebody, and so he was a criminal who was running to get away from the law. And murder like that, that would be at least, maybe what we call second-degree murder or manslaughter, maybe first degree, but it's a serious thing. And he comes back and, maybe he'll get in trouble for that. Oh, Moses, you finally made it back. Time for a trial. Number 15. Yeah, Elka.
Do you know why he killed someone or who he killed?
Yeah. If you were to look back in chapter 2, you would see that this Egyptian was a slave master or slave driver who was being very harsh with one of the Israelites. So Moses just kind of looked around and then killed him and then hid his body in the sand. Yeah, not quite, but. And then the next day, Moses sees 2 Israelite men fighting. And he's like, guys, you're on the same team. You're both Israelites. Knock it off. And one of the Israelites turns to him and says, what are you going to do? Are you going to kill me the way you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And then Moses got scared and he's like, uh-oh, if this gets found out, I'm going to get out of here. Because even though he was raised in Pharaoh's household, he was still an Egyptian, or he was still a Hebrew man. And he wasn't Egyptian. Number 15, how did Moses react to the plan that God proposes? Could summarize this if you would like, or parse out all the details from verse 11 and 1 and 10 and 13. So God says, go. Pharaoh says, or Moses says, no. God says, go. It's almost like a rhyme. And I think Elizabeth touched on this a little bit too. He's like, I can't do it. I am not the guy for this. I am not the man for this job. You should really send somebody else. Which is also another way of Moses saying, you made a mistake, God, in picking me. Which sounds eerily familiar to Adam and Eve, when God is at the tree with Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And Adam's like, I don't know, the woman you put here with me, she did it. As if to say, not just that this person, it was their problem, not mine, but God, you put her here. You should have known better. Come on. Number 16, how did God respond? Looking especially at chapter 4, verse 12.
So that he would fight for people. He just gave them 3 miracles so that they would believe him.
All right.
When he said that they might not understand him, God just kind of said that he would make it so they would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. God promised to be there to help him. It's kind of the way it's summarized. That God gave him 3 miracles that he could use in succession. Toss your staff down and it'll become a snake. Put your hand into your cloak and it'll become white like leprosy. And then dump out the Nile River water and it'll be different. So there's definitely that. And then toward the end there of chapter 4, it's like God's like, all right, just stop with your excuses. I'm going to send Aaron. He's on his way already. Any other questions or comments? Pretty straightforward. Next time, Next week will be our last class until next year. We will plow through the first 9 plagues, which is pretty fun. It is. All right, we'll close with prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for revealing yourself to Moses and for demonstrating that you are the God of free and faithful grace and that you desired to bring your people out of slavery. We thank you for using Moses to accomplish that and for demonstrating to us how much you care about us and how much your concern is played out in the instructions that you give to us. Lead us to learn from the example of Moses that you have an answer for every excuse, and that most of all, you desire what is for our good, which is the freedom not from slavery, but from sin, and the freedom that we have in Christ. We ask you to be with us today and always in Jesus' name. Amen.